apparently there's been a lot of claims of people getting data wiped for having insanely win low rates. So recently I got this comment, well, Menton shared this comment and saying, I recently got contacted by TDS staff about this video, and they've explained, I assume this video is, with the way that it's being described, spoilers, I think they were using a method to grind out the most amount of coins while losing, or gems while losing. However, I don't think that's the case. Losing a lot of times is not really the issue here, but I'll read this anyway. Using this strategy too much might get your TDS data wiped. Basically, your accounts get reset. Specifically, if your win/loss ratio gets under 0.05 at 500 losses, you are putting yourself at a high risk of being data wiped. Do the strategy in moderation. Do not get every tower in the game by doing this. I encourage you to play the game normally and only use this strategy occasionally. No, the strategy is not bannable if you're putting yourself at risk by being data wiped if you exploit the strategy too much. So please use this strategy in moderation. Now, there is some keywords here, mostly exploit. Why would you say exploit unless you're actually using an exploit? Because you're using an exploit. That's the problem here. But people saw this, I think, and then said, well, basically, people saw the main parts of it was like, well, your win-loss ratio is like 0.05 at 500 losses. You're at a risk of being data wiped because of that. I think what it was being told was correct, but that isn't the main issue. Having a low win ratio. I've seen some people with like insanely low win ratios, so that was like 500 wins to like 15,000 losses or something. That's not the main issue. And for example, some staff members also saying that. So for example, a low win-loss ratio will not get your data wiped, and loads of people telling this. One guy in my server had 2,000 losses and a few hundred wins and said this data might get wiped, and it says no, it's a myth from Deoxfrite. So some people are saying that this is all a myth. A lot of people are scared that you'll get data wiped, you get scared of data wipes, if you do like certain methods. Not the case, but there are some things that I think may get your data completely wiped. And in fact, if you go into any regular server, you probably won't find a lot of people with a win-lose ratio of close to 0.05. I think 0.05 was a statistic quoted to that person because it's so unusually high. So, like, for example, even though, say, this person with 216 wins and 1,800 losses, this guy clearly is probably grinding out some coins or whatever. He still has a win-lose ratio of 0.1212. He probably has like a load of towers, like the Ranger, the Minigunner, all that. Even he doesn't have a win-lose ratio of about that low. And as you can see, most people higher up. Yes, they have insanely high win rate. Okay, you, my friend, might be at risk of termination. No, not termination, data wipe. But you can see, load of people here, like their win-lose ratios, it's higher, it's lower than what my main account is. All of these are lower. So having a win-lose ratio of less than 1, it's not unusual, but you can see that these people are probably grinding out crates or whatever, grinding out coins, losing games on purpose to get coins. And I think that's why the developers changed from an exponential curve to a sigmoidal curve, because you get the least increases in coins between each wave at, say, the earlier waves and the later waves. It may not make sense, it may encourage mid-game losing strategies, but really that's the only way that they can make it kind of fair to prevent, well, losing at the start, but also encouraging players at the end to see out the game and triumph the game instead of, you know, losing on purpose right before the boss ends to maximize farming. Basically, developers, they don't like coin farming if you don't triumph. They just want you to triumph the game and get coins. They don't want repetitive losing strategies. But it's not to say that repetitive losing strategies aren't banned. You won't get stat wiped for it. It's just that if you have an unusually high amount, then you're likely to get... You're not even more likely. No, what people misinterpret is, if you do it manually over and over again, you're not really at a risk of getting stat wiped. Like, for example, if I go into a game right now and then lose on purpose however many times, keep restarting over and over again, that's fine. You're not going to get banned for that. Or stat wipes for that even. What you might get stat wiped for if you use a macro to do it, and developers can tell the difference between a macro and a player doing it manually. Player doing it manually, each game is unique if you do it manually. Using a macro, each game is basically the same, even if you code for things differently. I don't know how you even do things differently. But with a macro, it's very, very easy to tell if you're automating losing on purpose or if you're just doing the game manually and just doing a strategy to just lose on purpose. And, well, perhaps controversially, the developers have decided that using macros is an exploit. And that's what I think the person who was saying here, that's what I think this person who made this comment is saying. Because you don't use the word exploit unless you're exploiting. You don't exploit something unless you know that it's abusable. Well, that's what all exploits are. They're basically abusable. Macros are considered an exploit according to the developers. So therefore, what I think this person is saying, or misinterpreted, is a TDS staff reached out to them saying, you're exploiting the game and we can see that your win-loss ratio is 0.05 at about 500 losses. You're clearly using an exploit. You might get stat wiped. You should not be encouraging this behavior. Therefore, I think the cause and effect is the wrong way around. You're not going to get stat wiped if your win-lose ratio is like 0.05. No, you're going to get stat wiped if you're using an exploit, and they can and then you can very easily tell that because your win-lose ratio is 0.05. That's one of the factors that tells you you're using an exploit, but that's not the main factor. They can track games, we know that. Having a win-lose ratio of 0.05 does not automatically mean you're going to get data wiped. No, that's just one of the factors that they determine if you're using an exploit or not. And that does include a macro. So I think, actually, we know that the developers are cracking down pretty hard on using macros. People have said that people haven't been stat wiped. I'm not so sure about that. People have said that they've been stat wiped, or complained about being stat wiped. I don't know how much of it is hearsay and how much of it is actually true, but we know that the developers have done stat wipes in the past, although they haven't said too much about recent stat wipes. I've known in the past that there have been 2 stat wipes, but they're not related to using an exploit. But with the ban system that was added this year, it might be the case that they're cracking down quite hard on using macros to grind out the game, because we know they're tracking the game, and one of the reasons that they're tracking the game is to detect the use of macros. And I've seen in the past that they have a list of everyone who's used the macro, and they're sitting on the list, shall we say. They're not going to say what's going to happen to them. They're just not encouraging behavior, shall we say. So if I were you, I wouldn't use a macro. That's not saying don't use strategies that lose very quickly on purpose to get to maximize the amount of coins per hour or whatever, or gems per hour, but I wouldn't use macros to do that. So you need to manually be at your computer and do that. If they can see that you're on the game 24/7 a day using a macro, then obviously that's one of the factors. You're going to get stat wiped. Doing the strategy in moderation, even then, that's probably not going to do wonders for you. You're probably still they can probably still detect that using a macro, and that's technically an exploit. They can technically ban you. I mean, technically they can ban you for any reason, but using a macro is apparently one of the reasons that they've subscribed to banning in the game. I mean, in the past, people have used macros and they've displayed their discouragement against it, but they've not really taken much action. I think they have in the past with some exploits by patching some. Then again, I've never used a macro in my life. My win ratio is 0.76, and apparently that's quite high in comparison to literally everyone else on Tower Defense Simulator. Bottom line is, if your win-lose ratio is small, then you're going to get stat wiped. That's categorically wrong. That's one of the factors that they determine if you're using an exploit or not. I mean, if you're using an exploit to automatically win games, I think they'll detect that as well. Like if your win-lose ratio is like, actually, to be fair, I've not seen too many win-lose ratios that are incredibly high. Like I said, I haven't in the random server that I joined, there was no one above 1, and in fact, my main account would be the highest there. Again, it's incredibly hard to tell what the factors are to determine if you're using an exploit or not. They can probably tell within like 2 or 3 games if you use an exploit, aka using a macro. So I just wouldn't do it. And like, using this strategy too much might get your TDS data wiped. I think that if you use it once or twice, then probably you'll be fine. But if you use it, I don't know, 10, 20, 30, 40 times to get a golden crate, for example, you put yourself at risk of getting stats wiped. And this process is probably automated, so just don't bother. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why they added the loss counter in the first place, because when it was first added, I thought it was pretty useless. Like, why would you want to display how much losses you have? But no, one of the reasons that I think it was Below Natural who said to me that the reason for the loss counter being added back in the overhaul update was to tell who's using macros or not. And it seems quite pertinent now that people are being warned against using macros because, yeah, you can get stat wiped. So again, I don't know how much I've reiterated it. Just don't use it. If you're that paranoid, then you just shouldn't do it in the first place. If you don't give a damn, and you don't care if your data's wiped, then go ahead, go use a macro, but don't complain if your data's wiped. That's all I'm saying. And if you really do care about your account that much, just just play the game properly. Like, what else do you want me? I don't know. What do you want me to say? Actually play the game. Use Robux. In fact, you know what? That's a great idea. Just invest some time into a job and pay with real money to skip the game. I mean, yeah. I don't know what else to say. I can't.